Hi, everybody. It's Jean Humbrecht with Humbrecht Law, criminal and traffic defense attorney in Manassas, Virginia. Thanks for tuning into my semi-weekly local business spotlight. Today, I have a very special guest, a colleague, and someone I'm proud to call my friend, Tiffany Eisenhower. Tiffany is the broker, and she just told me, and I'm going to mess it up, broker and principal agent at Freedom Property Management. Is that correct?
Close enough. Close enough.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Tiffany basically owns Freedom Property Management, and I'm going to actually turn it over to her to tell you guys all a little bit about what she does and what property management is. And I will be sharing this video while she's doing that in different Facebook groups. Then we'll just have a conversation. And I just want to say to everybody watching, feel free to type any questions you have in the chat. Let us know you're there. Send comments because I can't see who's watching. I can only see how many people are watching. So if you want to shout out, say something. So Tiffany, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jean. Hi. I am Tiffany Eisenhower. Like Jean said, I am the principal broker and owner at Freedom Property Management. We are a small boutique residential and small commercial property management company and real estate firm based right in Manassas. We have been in business for almost 20 years, and we absolutely geek out and love everything residential property management. We love helping our landlord clients to reduce the hassle from being landlords and to help our renter clients have a really good experience as a renter in one of our properties. We serve the entire Northern Virginia area from the DC line out west to kind of Western Loudoun, Percival area down through Culpeper. We have a few properties in our portfolio that are in the Stafford, Fredericksburg area, and then up the 95 corridor. Again, mostly residential. We do some small commercial. But yeah, that's what we do in a nutshell.
Okay, so can you tell everybody what property management entails? If they own a property and they want to rent it out, what is it that you guys do to help them?
Okay, so we help with everything from start to finish. There's a lot of different definitions for property management. Property management could be commercial, like HOA or community. Property management could be that you're just collecting rent. What we do is full service. We step in and we are the landlord to the tenant on behalf of the landlord. And so most of the clients that we work with are out of state, if not out of country. And so they rely on us to make decisions quickly to solve problems at their property, to maintain their asset and to keep their tenant happy, and to keep our landlord out of trouble and out of needing to hire you to defend them. And so we do everything from helping them to prep the property for rent. It might be both cosmetic as well as health and safety repairs that would need to be done to the property before we're really putting it in front of a tenant. And then from there, it's marketing the property really well so that we're appealing to the highest quality tenants in the area quickly and efficiently and very in a high quality way, processing rental applications, getting really high quality leases in place. And then once that tenant is in the property, it's then maintaining that property, maintaining that relationship, the basics of collecting rent and receiving phone calls for maintenance. But it's also the after hours emergency phone calls, after hours emergency repairs, having really quality relationships with local vendors who are able to respond quickly to our properties and our tenants, enforcing leases, keeping our leases and our tenants and our owners in compliance with ever-changing landlord-tenant laws. And then at the end of the day, whether it comes time for renewing that lease with the tenant or moving the tenant out because the tenant has found something else that they want to move into, or maybe the landlord wants to move back into the property. We have a lot of what we call accidental landlords in this area. And we also have a lot of landlords that are military, State Department, that are going to be moving back into the property in 2 to 5 years. And so that whole process on the back end looks very different. But it's usually either renewing that tenant, getting a new tenant in place, the landlord moving back into it, or what we end up with a couple of times a year is a landlord has decided that they no longer want to be a landlord and they want to dispose of that asset or they want to sell it. And it could be because they don't want to pay capital gains. It could be because they want to use the money to buy a next house, or they just may have decided that being a landlord is not their strong suit and they don't have the risk tolerance and don't want to continue to be a landlord.
Okay. Now, you represent both landlords and tenants, I believe you said, correct?
So contractually, we have a property
Okay.
management agreement in place with the homeowner. We then are technically their agent, we're acting as the landlord for the tenant and to enforce that lease. But at the end of the day, we also need to make sure that we're taking care of our tenants because the laws go both ways. We
Mhm.
can't just say that we're going to enforce the landlord side of it, enforce the tenant side of it, and not also understand what the landlord's responsibilities are. And we also know that in order to maintain a good quality asset, in order for that property to be well maintained, to have a good long term tenant in place, to have a tenant that's going to communicate and pay, we need to keep them happy. And so that means responding quickly. It means taking care of repairs quickly. And it means being flexible and negotiating when it's reasonable.
Mhm. Now, you mentioned maintenance and after hours emergencies and things like that. So, is there like a 24-hour hotline kind of thing where something crazy happens? Say something's flooding and it's 3 o'clock in the morning. They can call you or somebody that you've contracted with, and someone will come out and fix it, take care of it.
Uh, we don't have an 800 number. Every phone call that comes into our office 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, has the
Hmm.
opportunity to reach a member of my live staff.
Okay.
And so we rotate that between our team, and so we found that we don't have the high volume to need to outsource it.
Hmm.
And so we rotate that within our team. We have general contractors, plumbers, electricians that
Hmm.
are local that know that if they get a phone call from us or they get multiple text messages from us at
Hmm.
11 o'clock at night on a Sunday, that they need to
Hmm.
respond.
Hmm.
So, we're very confident that within the portfolio and the geographic area that we have, we're able to respond to emergencies and get a contractor to that property within an hour.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, an hour is a good time and reasonable, I would think.
And
Um,
getting someone local on the phone pretty much immediately that's able to troubleshoot the problem
right.
and, and help the tenant to stop the water or
Hmm.
mitigate whatever the emergency might be happening.
Hmm.
That's what our top goal is as well, because a lot of water damage can happen in a 1 hour period of time. So we
Right.
want to do our best, whether it's a member of our team or we immediately get our contractor on the phone with the tenant so that the contractor can walk the tenant through that troubleshooting.
Hmm. Now, when you manage the property for the owner, does that mean that the renter might not ever have any communication with the landlord or really know who the person is? Like if I'm renting out my property, I will never meet that
Yep.
renter. It all goes through you, that you collect
Exactly.
the payment and send it to me.
Exactly. And
Okay.
that's our preference. So again, every management company does things a little different.
Hmm.
And our management agreement is set to where there's very low involvement from the individual landlord and there's a lot of authorization to the management company. We don't want the individual landlord getting in the middle. We don't want to create a situation where the tenant is playing bad cop, good cop between the property manager and the landlord. We don't want the tenant getting a no from us and then calling the landlord with a different story and then getting a yes from the landlord. So we want
Hmm.
to make sure that we're keeping the line of communication through the management company. We're the ones that know the background on landlord tenant laws. We know the lease inside and out. We know proper procedures. And so we really find that it's in our best interest, it's in our landlord's best interest and our tenant if everything comes through the property manager. We then, based on our management agreement with you, the landlord, we then get you involved as our contract stipulates.
Okay. Now, what happens if there's a problem with the person paying their rent or they're late, the property management company takes care of that? At what point does it have to go to an attorney? Just kind of tell us, for those of us who've never rented out a property,
Sure.
what would happen in that instance?
Okay. So, and it's very timely in terms of today is the 6th of the month. And we went through all of our delinquency process this morning. And so all of the leases that we have in place do have a 5-day grace period. And
Mhm.
all of our rent due on the first of the month.
Mhm.
With our rents due, oh, I'm getting people saying that the live is not on Facebook. So I'm not sure if there's anything on your side that you might need to do. I've had 2 people text me saying that they're either waiting or that the stream never came up. You do have it live on Facebook, yes?
Yeah, and it shows on StreamYard that we're still live, and I have my
All right,
internet.
cool.
Well, if anybody can hear this conversation, let us know, because it looks good on my end.
All right.
And I see there's viewers popping in and out, so
Okay, cool. Well, we'll figure it out. But anyway, so to answer your question, I'm sorry, I've gotten a little froggy.
yeah, it's dusty in here. I need my gigantic jug of water too.
So to answer your question, we have all of our leases with rent due on the first of the month. There's a 5-day grace period. And so on the 6th of the month, that's when late fees go into play. And that's when we provide our tenants with their 5-day non-compliance notice. It used to be called a 5-day pay or quit notice, is kind of what everyone is used to the terminology. We no longer use the pay or quit format because we don't want tenants just quitting the property. We want them to come back into compliance. So it's then giving them 5 days to pay their rent, pay late fees, before we then have the opportunity to start the eviction process. And the eviction process, as you know, starts with going to the courthouse and filing for an unlawful detainer hearing. We can do that at the end of that 5-day non-compliance notice timeframe. So the 11th of the month, or whatever the next business day is, or once you've reached that notice timeframe. So we then, for all of our property owners, would have the opportunity and the authority, based on our management agreement, to go into the courthouse to file that unlawful detainer, to get a court date set up. That court date would be 2 to 3 weeks out, depending on holidays and things of that nature, for that initial hearing date. So we're now on to the beginning of the following month if the tenant has not paid, let's say, their November rent. And then once that happens, if the tenant still has not paid, then we're going to go to that first return on behalf of the landlord. The only time that the landlord would have to hire an attorney is if the tenant then disputes and the judge sets it for trial and requires then representation. We're not lawyers. And so we would then be brought in as a witness. The landlord could either come to the local area to take care of it themselves and represent themselves, or they could hire a professional attorney to do so. So we have that happen very infrequently. Most of the time, what happens is we're able to get through the process on behalf of the landlord. We're able to mitigate and mediate with the tenant if there is a dispute at the time that that's happening, and try to collect as much of the funds as possible that the tenant may then back owe. Unfortunately, once you get to that point, there's very little guarantee that you're going to get anything in return from that tenant.
Right.
Which is why it's so important to do everything correct on the front end. You don't want to sacrifice the quality of tenant just to get a tenant in the property. You want to make sure that you've got a good quality tenant, a good quality lease in place. You've done all of your due diligence from your inspections and documentation, so that if something happens, if they forgot to check that crazy box on their application, you're as protected as possible. And I just got notification that my battery's about to die because I've been playing around with this so long. So I'm just going to go and plug in, but I'm still right here listening.
Okay, awesome. I do that too. That happens to me, and I'm like, oh crap! I hope I can find my cord.
Right.
So So regarding going, you said that it's very infrequently that it gets to the point that somebody has to hire a lawyer. Um, so I would assume that most people, most tenants that have to go to court for that unlawful detainer, and we can maybe get a little bit more specific if people have questions. I know what it is, but once they go to court for that first return, most of them admit that they owe the money, and they just say, they can't pay, or they need a payment plan, or something
Mhm.
like that?
Um, because it happens so unfrequently, honestly, every
Mhm,
situation is different.
mhm,
The last situation that we went through um, was with for a tenant that we acquired. The landlord came to us as a referral from a realtor because at that point the tenant was already about 4 months behind on rent.
oh,
And so that was about a year and a half ago. We helped the tenant to get compliant. We helped them to get up to date on their rent payments. And when it came time to renew the lease, the landlord said, "Look, we're not interested in continuing to rent this property to these tenants. We'd like to go ahead and get new tenants in place." And so we served a non-renewal. So this was not it wasn't a non-compliance or an eviction because of non-payment necessarily. It was because they became a holdover tenant and they
mhm,
didn't vacate, and
mhm,
then they stopped paying. So in that situation, we went through the same process, and unfortunately, we couldn't start marketing the property for the landlord to reduce their vacancy time because the tenants, we had a feeling they would not go out. Um, we went for our first return, and the tenants, unfortunately, they had a lot of medical issues, and so their income situation was not consistent, and they expressed to the court that they weren't having luck finding a place, so they needed more time. And the last thing that the judges want to do is to increase our homeless population. And so as much as possible, if the judges see that there's reason to provide the tenants with another opportunity, then they're going to recommend a payment plan. They're going to recommend mediation, and then give timeframes for the tenants to be in compliance. Unfortunately, with this one, the tenants did not stick to the plan, but it was still another almost 30 days before the next return date. So it
mhm.
was another 30 days before we got to the court. And then when we get to court and tenant comes up and says, "Yes, I'm not able to do this," judge says, "All right, well, then you need to be out within, your 10-day time frame." Um, and so at that point, that was 60-ish, 70-ish days after the lease expired before
Mhm,
we were able to execute that eviction.
mhm,
So every situation is a little bit different. That's an extreme, but when it comes to the properties and the tenants that we put in place right from the beginning,
mhm,
our eviction percentage is basically zero. Not only do we put really good quality tenants in place, but we make sure that they know that they can communicate with us. So we're getting ahead of problems before they become problems.
mhm, mhm. Okay. So what would you, I guess, what would be your advice for somebody who has never rented out a property that they own, whether it's business or personal? Um, like what's the first thing they should do? Because they don't know the laws. They obviously
Mhm.
don't want to be in violation of the laws. They don't want to have to pay me or one of my colleagues down the road. So if
Yep.
somebody's thinking about renting their property, what do they do first?
So the first thing to do is to talk to and interview a couple of property managers.
Hmm.
You'll also want to talk to your realtor of choice, but understand that most realtors, their specialty is buying and selling houses. Buying and selling houses, while a part of that is the same as marketing a house for lease or finding you a tenant,
Hmm.
the landlord tenant side of being a landlord, the whole legal side of the VRLTA, most realtors never really get into the meat of that because it's not what they do on a daily basis.
Hmm.
And so interviewing a couple of property managers is what I would say needs to be the first thing that you do as a new prospective landlord. You also want to take a really hard look at your tolerance. What's your tolerance to financial risk? What's your tolerance to the emotional effect of being a landlord? Can you handle being that that front person to your tenant? Do you have the capability to have those 11 o'clock at night phone calls? Can you treat this as a business and not make this personal? And some people are very good at that. And so they can DIY, and they may not need a professional property manager, but they need someone to help them find a good tenant. Everyone's going to be a little different on that. When it comes to the financial tolerance, as we just went through that example with the delinquency, having at least 4 months worth of your carrying costs available to you as the landlord is a minimum that we recommend to our landlord clients. Because if you're not able to cover the mortgage and the HOA and the condo and the taxes on your rental property, if you're waiting for and needing this month's rent to pay this month's mortgage, and something happens, like your tenant has a major life situation and they're not able to pay their rent anymore, or like what happened in another one of our properties just recently, there was a slow leak from the water heater, and between tenants, everything dried up. And so when we went to go and do a move-in inspection for the brand new tenants and walk through the property, there was no evidence of a water leak. Nothing was wet because the property wasn't occupied. It wasn't being used. The water heater wasn't running. New tenants moved in. Within a couple of weeks, the tenants notice a water stain on drywall. They notice that the floor is saggy in a certain area. We then get someone out to investigate that, and it turns out that there's been a slow, long leak with the water heater, to the point that we had to get a professional water and mold mitigator in there. And they've been in the property for 3 weeks doing a variety of demo of waterlogged building materials, drying the house out, replacing the water heater. And then now we have to go in and rebuild the parts of that house that were just damaged. We're looking at $15,000 to $20,000, and insurance isn't covering any of it. So situations and in this situation, the tenant was not comfortable staying there. And so it was in the landlord's best interest to let the tenant leave. So the landlord just paid a bunch of money to their contractor to fix the house, to get ready for new tenants, paid leasing commissions to get a new tenant in the house, and now is paying another $15,000 to $20,000 to mitigate this water damage and get a new water heater in place, and is going to have to find a brand new tenant after this is all done and have vacancy in the middle of winter. And most of that is not going to be covered by insurance, depending on the insurance that the landlord has. In this case, her insurance has denied every claim that we've tried. So the financial risk, not only for tenant not paying, but also for damage to the house that may not be able to be preventable, for replacing major systems. If your heating goes out in the middle of winter, it's not reasonable to wait 1 week, 2 weeks to find money to pull cash advances from credit cards. That's not reasonable for the tenant to make them wait that long. And so we want to make sure that if you're deciding to be a landlord, you have that ability to reach into your pocket to get a decent chunk of money if it happens. It doesn't happen all the time. But when it happens, if it happens to you and you're not prepared, it can be a pretty significant financial, issue for some people. So we like to have those conversations right at the beginning. And that might mean that we're talking people out of being a landlord, or they may not want to work with us because they may think that we're all doom and gloom. But I'd much rather be real and set some very realistic expectations. 99.99% of the time, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But if you are that 0.1% a person, then it could be a significant impact for you. And we'd like to prevent that.
You mentioned insurance a minute ago. I know you're not an insurance agent, and I don't want to spend forever talking about it, but can you just tell everybody like what you mean by their insurance doesn't cover it? Like what you
Sure.
need in place as a landlord to protect
Yep.
yourself and what you need to require the tenant to have and why.
Yep. So yes, I'm not an insurance agent. I'm also not a lawyer, but I'm required to know all the details, right? Um, so, um, so yes, every insurance company is going to have different coverages and different endorsements and different riders that they can put on your insurance. Um, for your tenant, you always want to require that the tenant that's living in your property has their own renter's insurance. And that renter's insurance is going to have a liability portion and a personal property portion. You're worried as a landlord about the liability coverage. You want to make sure that you have a minimum of $300,000. That's our recommendation, and liability coverage from your renter on their policy, and that they have named you as the landlord as an additional insured. What
Mhm,
that's going to do is if, God forbid, your tenant goes to work one morning and they leave the bathtub running, and the bathtub runs all day long and it floods out your unit and it floods out the unit below you,
mhm,
that's negligence on your
mhm,
tenant.
mhm,
So, but your neighbor below you doesn't care. The condo association, your HOA doesn't care, and you still need to fix the property. So you're going to go to your insurance, and your insurance is then going to look to the tenant to cover their negligence. And if your tenant doesn't have liability insurance, then there's nothing there to back you up. And most of your renter policies as a landlord are going to require that your tenant have insurance in order for you to be available and accessible to certain coverages.
mhm,
Um, so, as a landlord, you always want to make sure your renter has their insurance. Now, you as a landlord, what do you need? You need to have your own property coverage and liability coverage. So, your property coverage is going to be different depending on the type of property you have. If you have a condo, a lot of that's going to be covered under your condo master policy. So, and your insurance agent is going to walk you through all of
mhm,
that. Liability side as well, you're going to want to make sure that you're covering your risk, your liability. If your tenant falls down the stairs, if they have a party and someone jumps off the balcony, you've got liability insurance if someone decides to sue you, because you can sue anybody for anything. Now,
mhm,
with the situation that we just described with the water leak, there's a number of different endorsements or riders that can be added onto an insurance policy to cover things such as water backup, flood, mold, um, tenant damage, tenant displacement, loss of income. Those are all extras. And so we always advise that our landlord clients have a very detailed conversation with their insurance agent and talk to multiple insurance agents, because you can't just, it's not just a plug and play. It can be, but then you may not be covered if something like this happens. And so having the conversation to say, all right, what's it going to cost for me, and what policies are available if I want to add sewer backup, if I want to be covered if something leaks and it creates mold. What's that going to do for my premium? What's that going to cover for me? And also understanding that as a landlord, like, you, just because your insurance doesn't cover it doesn't mean you're not still responsible to the contract with your tenant. And so you're responsible for acting promptly and repairing and mitigating that issue, whether or not your insurance is going to cover it. So having the full picture at the beginning is always the better route to go.
mhm. So I was just having a conversation with an attorney who practices a different type of law than I do yesterday. And it just delved into other things, and we were talking about, the more you have to potentially lose, or we're talking about car insurance, but the more you have in your life to potentially lose, like the money that you've set aside for your kids' college and all this
Mhm.
stuff. And if you have a business and, whatever the case may be, if you've got money or assets to lose, you want to make sure that you probably have the most coverage you can get in case something does happen.
Mhm.
Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you have, well, I know you can't plan for every single thing in life, but if you basically have all of the riders and the amendments and the additional coverage and maximum coverage limits and all that stuff, what would happen? Well, you tell me what would happen. Say something happens. Say you've got the maximum coverage, or your renter has the coverage you require them to have, that you're told, that they have, the maximum, they do everything that you want them to do, right? Something happens and that person sues, like say somebody falls or gets drunk and falls off a balcony or whatever. And that person
Mm-hmm.
sues the renter, right? And
Mm-hmm.
sues the owner and then goes after
Yep.
well, if it's a condo, I guess the condo association. And then, so what happens at that point is having that insurance in place that basically covers, maybe not all of it, but it would cover what that person is suing for if you have the maximum coverage for everything.
Hopefully. I mean, you're right in that, the more you have, the more you have to lose. And so as you're building your wealth, you also want to make sure that as a part of your wealth strategy, that you're insuring it properly. And at some point, it then is reasonable to have more of an umbrella policy, a liability policy that's covering kind of everything instead of just one, just your car, just your house, just this. And that's also why a lot of people start LLCs and may put assets into LLCs. They may put their rental property into an LLC to help to protect their family assets if something like that happened. And so having the appropriate amount of liability insurance in place is going to help to protect your assets. It's hopefully going to pay for attorneys, it's going to pay for settlements, it's going to pay for all of those things. And then your insurance company and the tenant's insurance company and the condo insurance company and my insurance company, because my management company is not being left out of this lawsuit. If someone wants it, they're going to come after all of us. So all of our insurance companies are then working together to make the best situation possible on behalf of you, our client. There's no magic wand. There's no crystal ball to know exactly what's going to happen. I wish I had one. But yeah, and it's going to be different for everybody. So talking to the appropriate people, asking the right questions, but that's also where the problem starts, is not a whole lot of people know what questions to ask. And so that's why I really appreciate you asking me to be, on your live today, so that hopefully I'm helping to give people an idea of different questions to ask and things to consider before they decide to be a landlord, or if they're a renter, what they should be doing and what they should be asking for, or things that they could do in the future to build their total portfolio and their wealth.
Well, I mean, I would think that most people who want to rent out property think of the basics, hopefully, like having an airtight lease. But again, why do we have lawyers that deal with contract law? Because sometimes stuff is not airtight, or people find a loophole, or like you said, they just don't pay. And then there's certain avenues that you are required to go through by law to get them out, even if they are in clear violation of that lease. So yeah, there's the lease, there's the insurance, and they want to find a good quality tenant. But at the same time, we didn't even talk about fair housing and all that stuff. Maybe we can just briefly touch on that. But they don't think about, or I would assume that they don't do this with malintent, but they don't think about the laws that they could be breaking just by asking certain questions and it being taken the wrong way. Like they don't rent to person X because of whatever that person claims that they did. So before I go on and start saying incorrect things, why don't you tell us briefly about the fair housing and just what you would advise to somebody to basically, so they don't get in trouble.
Yeah, sure. So we like to take, and that's one of the reasons as well why we have built our management company and our processes in a way where our landlords don't have a lot of interaction with our tenants, and we're being proactive with establishing guidelines with you before situations happen. So for example, one big area of exposure for a lot of landlords is at the time that they're marketing the property for new renters. They're receiving inquiries from new renters. They're showing the property, and they're receiving and processing rental applications, and providing an approval or a denial. That's a huge area of exposure regarding fair housing, privacy, and Fair Credit Reporting Act. Those are three, and VRLTA. So 4 very large, very important pieces of legislation that most individual landlords that are just, hey, I'm just renting out the house that I moved out of. Like, this is no big deal. It's just a condo, it's just there. I just want, a young professional couple that has no kids and no animals that, work for a good company. I just want someone good that's going to live there. We have that conversation almost on a daily basis. And so we then have to make sure that we're educating appropriately and saying, I understand that that's what you want. At the end of the day, you are bound by fair housing. You're bound by the Fair Credit Reporting Act. You're bound by the statutes that are in place. And so we want to make sure that we are guiding you to make decisions based off of data, not based off of ambiguous feelings that you may have about a certain person, or things that really don't matter. And so we take the position of, well, if we were going to be lending you money, and I have a background in lending and retail banking, so I brought that into my property management journey. So we take the perspective of, if we were going to be lending you money, how are we going to justify that you're able to repay that money? So we're going to collect income documentation, and we want to make sure that we can verify that. Mm-hmm. So it's reportable. You either have taxes to report it, you have W-2s, you have a business that files taxes, and you have a K-1, you have 1099s, you have a P.L.L. statement, you have verifiable and documented income that proves that you have consistent income of X amount. And then we want to say, well, what's been your ability to repay? How do you behave when it comes to paying your obligations? The number one way to do that across the board, that is as fair as possible, is through credit scores and credit reports. So we then take that information, and then we're going to look at what the overall debt to income is, what the overall rental history has been, to say, does this individual meet or exceed these credit and approval guidelines that we set in place with you, the landlord, ahead of time. So backing up just a little bit, we want to set up thresholds with you so that we're being proactive, not reactive. Meaning, we get 2 rental applications. One rental application is for 2 individuals that want to rent your 2-bedroom condo, and those 2 individuals make a total of $100,000, and versus 4 individuals that are all unrelated, and they may have 2 dogs and they have 3 kids, and they all want to rent your 2-bedroom condo. We want to make sure that ahead of time, we know from you, number one, are there occupancy guidelines with your unit and with your county and with your city? What are your income requirements? What's our credit guideline that we're looking for? So that we are evaluating on a very proactive and not a reactive basis. So it doesn't matter to us what those individuals do for work. It doesn't matter to us where they earn their income, as long as it's documented and verifiable. But if we know that the 2 individuals together meet or exceed the income amount, meet or exceed our credit guidelines, and the other individuals, number one, they may exceed our occupancy guidelines. And so that's going to automatically be in a denial, because they exceed the occupancy guidelines because of the number of people. We're not even getting into the details of income and credit and things of that nature. So we take a lot of that off of the plate of our landlords at Freedom, because we do this, we live this on a daily basis. And there's no need for you to be listening to the stories, listening to the life history, and making a decision as to whether to approve or deny a person because they're a good person. because of who they might know, because of, whatever their situation is. We want to make sure that we're putting you into a position that is going to position you for success, the best in the future. So fair housing is going to cover a number of different discrimination categories. You can't approve or deny an application. You can't treat someone differently at the beginning, during the application process, or as you're processing out, as they're in their lease, or as you're processing out their security deposit. You can't treat them differently because of their age, of their gender, of their ethnicity, of their familial status, of their veteran status, of their source of income. And those are just a few number of situations where we've got to make sure that the way in which we're talking to tenants, the way in which we're responding to inquiries, that we're processing applications, that we're addressing maintenance, that we're not discriminating based on any of those protected classes, and that we're not allowing our landlords to accidentally discriminate based off of any of those familial status or any of those protected classes.
So it sounds like the fair housing law governs, and I will just preface by I focus on criminal just because I'm a lawyer doesn't mean I know all the laws about everything. So the fair housing laws cover protected classes, and it sounds like probably more because you mentioned veterans and familial status, because protected classes like race, gender, etc. But we don't get into
you have federal, you've got federal protected classes, and then there's additional protected classes under Virginia. And one part of that is also disability. And within that disability includes your emotional support animals and your service animals.
Well, I would, well, just here's a question, and I don't know the answer to this. Can you say no pets allowed, but if someone has a service animal, that's an ADA issue, so they're exempt from your rule of no pets allowed, right?
So yes, so ADA doesn't apply to residential dwellings. ADA applies to public spaces. Okay. What applies is fair housing, and you're not discriminating against, it's the disability protected class. So if that animal is able to be verified as an emotional support animal, then yes, you cannot say no.
But okay, so I guess what I'm asking is, I can say as an owner, I don't want pets. However, I can't do that if somebody has an emotional support animal. Like my rule against, I can have a rule with no pets, but if somebody doesn't have the emotional support animal, then they can't just bring their dog. But if somebody has an emotional support dog, like, and it's verified, whatever, they can bring that. And I'm not violating anything by saying no pets, because they just have to be able to bring it.
Yes.
Okay.
However,
however,
our recommendation with all of our properties is to be case by case on pets. Over 70% of all renters have at least one animal. And so if you say no to pets, then you're excluding a very large population of potential renters who would be interested in your property. You're also increasing your chance of a not legitimate emotional support animal being turned into an emotional support animal so that they can have the property without paying additional deposits and rents.
Okay.
Not everybody who has an emotional support animal is doing it for the right reasons. And unfortunately, they make it very difficult for those who do need the emotional support animals. Even though we're verifying the validity of the need for the emotional support animal, we can't question it. If we have a letter that's dated 2 days ago and it checks all the boxes, we cannot investigate. Because then you're really walking a thin line with fair housing. And so we have a very detailed process, and there's actually, there's vendors, there's companies that have created services specifically to help landlords and property managers navigate this process of pets in a much more streamlined way. There's one big one. It's actually it's based here in Virginia. It's called petscreening.com. And a lot of property management companies and individual landlords have contracts with this service that then provides us with the resource that we send the tenant to petscreening.com. They complete a pet profile. The folks at petscreening.com are then doing the research and asking the questions and getting the documentation, and they're going into their database to see, is this individual, has this tenant, not only on the emotional support animal side, but also bite histories, vaccination records, things of that nature, to confirm that the animal is in fact an emotional support animal, is a service dog, and things of that nature, so that the property manager or the landlord can then have more confirmation. They can have more assurance that the pet or the animal that's coming into the home is what it's supposed to be.
If an animal that is in a rental property, like let's say there's a dog and it bites somebody, can that person that's bit sue the landlord?
Yes.
What? How can they sue the landlord?
As you know, as a lawyer, you can sue anybody for anything. So they could sue the landlord for having a tenant with an aggressive dog. And even if that dog did not have a bite record. And even if the landlord says, I didn't approve an animal, I didn't approve a dog, then it's still going to come back to the tenant and landlord in that situation are kind of in one, they're all in one position. Whereas the individual who was injured is trying to get compensation for their damage. They're trying to prove negligence, and they're going to pull everybody into that picture as they can to support their argument.
Now, how do you...
So if landlord doesn't know about it, then landlord needs to make sure, okay, have I been doing inspections to verify? Did I do a thorough screening at the beginning of my application to ensure that this animal or that these tenants did or did not have a pet? Does my lease state, have a solid pet policy in place? Did I require my renters to have renter's insurance? And if the renters have an approved pet, do they have an appropriate rider for their pet on their insurance policy? So as a landlord, you want to make sure that you've done all of those things along the way. So if something does come up, you've got as much documentation as you need to prove that you're not negligent. You did everything that you were supposed to, that you could, to make sure that your renter did not bring an animal into the property that had a bite record. So documentation there and following the process is going to be key to protect yourself on the back end.
Let me ask you a question, because something you just said made me think of this. You mentioned inspections. Can a landlord go into, let's say I'm going to ask two questions. Let's say there's no property management company. Can a landlord go into a property that he owns, that he is renting, to, like you said, inspect it, make sure there's no violations, blah, blah, blah? And can you, as a property management company, go into a property that you're managing randomly or with notice or whatever to inspect and make sure there's no prohibited animals, etc.?
Yes, with appropriate notice. So if it's the only time that you can just stop by is if it's an emergency. Otherwise, you're required to give reasonable notice. Reasonable notice in most cases is 24 to 48 hours.
Yeah. Okay. But if you manage my property, you can tell the tenant in, 2 days on Friday at 3, we're coming to blah, blah, blah. But then they can just hide whatever. Well, they can't hide it if they have a dog and they're not supposed to. You'll know there's a dog in.
So one of the things that we found within our management company, because of the relationships that we've built with a lot of the contractors that work for us, that do our repairs, that do our landscaping, that do our electrical, whatever it is that they do for us. We've used a lot of them for a very long time. They understand how to talk to tenants. They understand the responsibility to our landlords. They are our extra eyes and ears in the property.
Mm-hmm.
And so while if the tenant is negligent, if they're not in compliance with their lease, and we go and we do a pre-scheduled inspection. So we do property inspections 3 months after a new tenant moves in,
Mm-hmm.
and then on a 6-month rolling basis from there.
Okay.
And we give them notice. We let them know, hey, this is your month that you're going to be due for your routine inspection.
Mm-hmm.
The inspector is going to be reaching out to you, at least 24 hours in advance to schedule a time to come by. And when they come by, they're going to need to access every room in the house. They're going to need to look in the attic if it's accessible, all of that. It should be pretty quick, non-intrusive. We're going to take a couple of generic photos.
Mm-hmm.
If there's something quick and easy that we can fix while we're there, we're going to do it. Otherwise, it's not a time for us to do repairs. It's a time for us to identify issues. And it's also tenants' opportunity for them to tell us if anything has come up, if we need to address anything. And we then at that point report back to landlord or report back to tenant what action items are.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say we go and we do that 3-month inspection, and there's a couple of item laundry lists that need to be done for the landlord. We send the contractors in a week later to do this list. Now we've told the tenants, hey, tenants, here's the list of things that we need to get taken care of for the landlord. ABC Contracting is going to be coming by. Expect to hear from them to schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Tenants do not clean up for contractors. So having a really solid relationship with your contractors means that they're going to be best friends with your tenants. And then they're going to take photos, they're going to take documentation, and then they're going to report back to us.
Mm-hmm.
So we may only go into the property twice a year, but if our contractors are in there 3, 4, 5 times a year, it's as good as us being in the property as well, because they're keeping their eyes open. If they see evidence of an animal, they're going to report back to us. We then are able to do a drive-by, because that's then a non-compliance situation. We can serve tenants with a non-compliance notice. The
Mm-hmm.
tenants can send us, or the contractor can send us photos or video while they're there. I mean, at that point, the tenant knows that they have to clean up the next time the contractor comes over.
Yeah.
But we've having those relationships really helps every aspect of the process, both with getting good repairs done as well as having good eyes on the property.
Mm-hmm. I didn't think about that. I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah, we have very often that our property owners will have their own contractors that they'll want us to use, or they have a home warranty or something of that nature. And while on one hand, that's great because, a home warranty company might save you a little bit of money. Your neighbor who is a licensed contractor might save you a little bit of money. But do they know the landlord-tenant laws? Do they know how to talk to your renter? Are they going to be able to respond in a timely manner to repairs?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
while, yes, if it's not an emergency, we don't want to jump. Like, we don't have to jump if it's not an emergency. But if you're a renter and your garbage disposal isn't working, you don't want to wait 2 weeks. You don't want to wait a week for the home warranty to get out there. You'd rather it get done the next day. How wonderful, how wowed would you be as a tenant if you put in a request today, says, hey, my garbage disposal isn't working. End of day, contractor calls you, hey, do you have availability tomorrow or Friday to get your garbage disposal fixed? Like, that's the type of experience that we want to provide to our tenants and our landlords. The tenant's going to be like, wow, like my landlord really cares. They really want to take care of my property. They're getting this fixed as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the benefits with using a local reputable management company that has those vendor and contractor resources, and allowing us to use our vendors and contractors.
Mm-hmm. I could keep asking questions for hours because I keep thinking of questions, But I'm going to
But
stop.
we'll just have to do another one.
We will, because we're at 55 minutes, and maybe we can like try to like focus on one particular thing, because then if we don't, I'll just clearly go off on tangents. But the whole point that I didn't intend to make is that people don't think about these things. I'm an attorney and I didn't think about all of these things. However, I did think that I need to talk to somebody who knows more than I do about it. And like anything, right? Like, can you do
Yep.
your own taxes? Sure. But you probably should talk to an accountant, at least, get an opinion before you try doing it yourself. There are
Exactly.
professions for a reason who
Exactly.
focus on what you focus on and what I focus on.
Yes. Yes. 100%.
Okay, so I don't want to take up any more of your valuable time. We do have to do this again, by the way, because this was great. Is there anything that you want to leave everybody with, like something that you would just like warn people about, or just something to keep in mind, or just whatever?
Oh, goodness. I guess as a parting is, not everyone is built to be a landlord. But if you have the right resources, you have the right support system, you have the right team, that makes a world of difference. So bring us on early, talk to us early. Even if you're not looking until spring or summer of next year, talk to us now. Get a plan in place now so that you have one more thing checked off your list. You know what's coming, and you can make a much more educated decision as to, number one, whether to rent or to sell.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, do you DIY your rental or do you hire a professional property manager? And if you would like to use a professional property manager in your Northern Virginia, we would be happy to help you. Freedom Property Management, it's www.freedompm.com. And we would love to have a conversation and see if it's a good fit.
Awesome. Well, thanks for giving us that to think about in closing, because that is true. You do need to plan. You can't just decide, well, not that this would happen to most people, but you can't just decide next week I'm going to rent out my house and I'm just going to do it myself. No, like we'd have to do repairs and all the other stuff that you didn't even think about. So that's actually a good point that I'm glad you brought up, talking to somebody beforehand when you're thinking about it, so that.
And bring us in before you start doing the repairs, because you may not need to replace carpet. You may not need to paint something. Preparing your house for rent is a lot different than preparing your house for sale or preparing your house for yourself. So bring us in early so that you're doing the appropriate things. And you may not even know half of the things that you're required to do or required to have when you're a landlord in your house.
Mm-hmm.
That might be the topic of our next live, is the repairs and maintenance that you have to do as a landlord.
Ugh. Okay, we'll schedule that soon, because
Okay.
you're like, oh, I need to paint, I need to replace the carpets, and yeah, that might make it look nice, but maybe those aren't the things that you should do, and I don't know what those things are, so we're not going to keep talking about it because it's already been like almost. Oh, Stacy Bowman just joined us. She loved the live. She said, always a wealth of knowledge and information. Thanks for sharing.
Aw, Stacy's on my team at the Freedom Real Estate team at LPT Realty. That's our sales division.
Okay, so not only do they do property management, they also can help you buy and sell a house.
Exactly. Yes, we can.
All right, so I always forget to tell people, Tiffany, but once we end the broadcast, you and I will still be here like we were before it started.
Okay.
So you don't have to go anywhere, but I know we both have a million things to do. But thank you, everybody, so much for tuning in and the engagement. I see a lot of people have been popping in and out, and some people have been on for a majority of the time, even though we've been an hour. This was
Thank you for being on.
It's really very helpful, because like I said, I don't think a lot of people think about this. So just having the knowledge is the first step, right?
Yeah,
and thank you,
exactly.
Stacy, for commenting. And I saw Stacy this morning at 1 Million Cups. I haven't been there. Nicholas and Carmen determined that it's been a year and a half, because last time I was there, they did their first presentation.
Wow. I was so upset that I wasn't able to make this morning, but I had a window being replaced at our office and I needed to be there between 8 and 9 for them to show up, and they showed up right at 9 o'clock.
Of course, because that always happens.
Of course, because I wanted to get to Cups, but I'm sure they did absolutely fantastic.
They did. And I had to duck out early because, court work, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But again, thank you, Tiffany. Thanks everybody for watching, and I will see you for my next live in 2 weeks with business coach Dave Miles out of Winchester. Thanks, everybody.
Excellent. Bye.